We are continuing in the book of Mark, and we are into a very interesting and curious portion of Scripture, one of three within the Gospels that deal with the subject of eschatology. If you know that theological word, it has to do with final things. This is a challenging subject in many ways because the Bible is not always as tidy as we would like to think that it is in regards to this subject, and I don't need to tell you that there are varying ideas within the Christian church in regard to this subject. I'm not going to get into great details. I'm just going to tell you what this text says and point out something that Jesus really wanted us to understand, to just simply be ready. It is always good for us to be brought back to sharpen our focus on where we're headed. Jesus predicted the end, and it's good for us to be reminded of where we're going as a people. There is no end to these kind of predictions. You might be aware, I'm not sure if you know this, but the most recent prediction for the end of all times is December 21, 2019. So have no fear, we'll get our Christmas banquet in before then. So we'll just organize our calendar. But December 21 is because, if you don't remember this, but the Mayan calendar ended on December 21st, 2012, and nothing happened, even though, of course, there were all kinds of books that said this was the end of all things. The Mayan calendar ended in 2012, but if you add 7 years, which is a magic number in biblical times, 7 years to 2012, you get to 2019. So now we've moved it on. There's another whole book come out. If you're not familiar with that, you better get ready and start packing your bags, because apparently this one is for real. There is no end to these kind of things. We're always talking about the end of the end, and it seems to be a constant theme within our culture. But we are well aware of what Jesus' words are in this very passage, verse 32, concerning that day or that hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. We see even something of how Jesus set aside his glory, set aside even his knowledge of future things in this moment as the Son of Man. And even he confesses, if I don't know, you don't know. Nobody knows. If we could just get our handle on this simple truth, it would save ourselves a lot of headache when all of these things come out and try to ripple our feathers. But we are constantly curious about the end. In fact, it is so important a subject that this very passage, this event, we call it the Olivet Discourse, it is repeated in 3 of the Gospels, in Matthew 24, Mark 13, which we'll look at this morning, and Luke 21, parallel passage, all dealing with the subject of final things. Jesus wanted his disciples, not only in that day, but to this day, to be aware, to pay attention, to be ready. Here's what the text says, verse 1, chapter 13, a bit of context of how we get to final things. As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." What is he referencing? This is, as I mentioned to you earlier in the series when we were talking about the fig tree, he is talking about what we have termed the third temple. The third temple is the temple that Herod built in Jerusalem, and it was at the time probably a wonder of the world. It was a massive structure. It was enormous. This is a computer-generated idea or view of what the temple would have looked like. There is no temple today because it was destroyed. We'll get to that in a few moments. But this place was made out of white marble. Parts of it were covered in pure gold. It gleamed in the sunlight. There are historians for the first century that almost run out of words to express the vastness and the glory of this building. It was really a sight to see. Some of the stones we know from what we know from that era, some of the stones weighed well over 100 tons. These are numbers that are so big that my head doesn't really grasp this. Of course, not being a builder, I don't really fully understand this. The largest measuring just over 44 and a half feet by 11 feet by 16 and a half feet. I'm not sure the dimensions of that, but I think if you picture a boxcar from a train, that's pretty much close to the size of some of these rocks. They weighed approximately 567 to 628. These are very precise numbers in tons. Most of the stones range between 2.5, 3.5 by 15 feet. approximately 28 tons. They moved them. I don't know how they did this. It was a feat, bar none, and it was a tremendous building. So they're walking through this building, and they say, wow. That's basically what's happening. Look at this building. It's amazing. By the way, it is also huge. The temple, surrounding courtyards. The temple is the structure that you see mostly in the middle there. The courtyards are around, and I don't know if the picture does any justice. There's little teeny tiny dots here towards the front. Those are people. Helps to just give you some degree of understanding of dimensions. Again, just a computer-generated picture, but it's so large that it takes 1/6 of all of Jerusalem. Could you imagine if there was a church in Bracebridge? What would be the church of Bracebridge? It would probably be a Tim Hortons. That's where most people worship on a Sunday morning. Could you imagine if there was a building that was 1/6 the entire size of this town? Could you imagine that? If it was a Tim Hortons, there would still be a lineup at the drive-thru, but it would be absolutely enormous, to use the word. So this is the fascination. I'm trying to catch you on. We can't understand it fully, but just to kind of give you some idea of where this is coming from. They are utterly fascinated by this edifice that they're walking through. Now we know also from John 2, 18 to 20, that this also took many years. The Jews said to him, that's to Jesus, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Now don't get distracted by the context. I just want to catch you what the Jews say. But he's talking about his own body, right? They misunderstand him. Well, the Jews said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple." That is the reference that we know in history, how long it took for Herod. It was Herod who built this temple. It's called Herod's temple. He built this temple, and it took 46 years. That's a long time, even by today's standards, to build one building. So it was massive. Jesus comes out with this. They're looking at this building, this glorious temple, these massive stones, and Jesus just it almost feels like he just kind of brushes this off with his hand. Jesus said to them, "You see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." That probably had their jaws drop right to the floor. What? Are you kidding me? This place with these massive stones took 46 years, and you're telling me there's coming a day when not one stone will be on top of another? Well, I don't know if you know this, but that little phrase that Jesus just kind of tossed out there, it's exactly what took place at that temple, and that is why we have no pictures of it or no idea of exactly what it looked like. This temple was fully and formally destroyed in 70 AD, not long after these very words that Jesus spoke them. It happened to Titus Vespasian, through Titus Vespasian, who was in charge of that region. There was some upheaval that came after Jesus' resurrection in the early time of the church through the book of Acts. There was great persecution amongst the church, and they were fleeing, and Jewish people began to uprise against Rome, and there was all kinds of problems and fights. And so the Roman government kind of clamped down on the Jewish people, sent this guy in to deal with them, and one thing led to another, and before you know it, the entire temple is razed, and people are being killed, and Jews are fleeing, and it became a catastrophe amongst the Jewish people. It put an end to all sacrifice, which is exactly what was predicted. It put an end. This is why to this day, Jewish people do not know what tribe they're from. All records and bookkeeping was all burned and destroyed in the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. No Jew today knows what tribe they're from. They don't understand all the semantics of their history. It was gone to them. That is why to this day, Jews do not have animal sacrifices, because they have no temple. They are waiting for the day, in their understanding of the Old Testament and ours as well, for that temple to be re-erected. Again, that's another subject. But this was such a historic event that, in fact, it got put into stone. This is a relief in an archway called the Arch of Titus, if I'm not mistaken, where there is a carving of them pillating and taking all the goods from the temple and bringing it to Rome. The archway celebrating this Roman victory of them taking the spoils. We still see today, and this is how we know how big some of these rocks were, the stones that were torn down still lie in the same place. If If you go to Jerusalem, you can go and visit the old temple, and that is pretty much what it looks like to this day. So when Jesus threw this little statement out there, nobody could believe that all the stones could come down. But here's the deal. If Jesus predicted that that could take place, and it did, then what we're doing with this text is realizing that when he talks about other things that are yet to come, we begin to take Jesus very seriously. That this is not just an interesting little notion that the church has made up to talk about one day there's going to be some bad stuff happening and one day Jesus is going to come back again. How do you know that's true? Because the beginning of the prediction that Jesus made actually was fulfilled. So verse 3, Jesus sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple. I just want to give you a little geography because you don't care and it makes it more interesting for me to bore you. So Jesus is now going to, the rest of this discussion that takes place happens on the Mount of Olives. And just again to explain the geography, that means he left the temple with his disciples. He made his comment, not one stone is going to be left upon another, and they now leave the temple. They're probably mulling this over. The disciples are very curious about this statement, and they've obviously left because the next statement is they went to the Mount of Olives, which means they went down into the Kidron Valley. That's a picture here of the valley. It's not very deep. They would have walked across and up the other side, and that is a picture of the Mount of Olives. It's only about 1,000 feet, 300 meters of height. It's not very large. They got to the top of that. They sat down, and they seem to have turned around, and now they're looking back at Jerusalem, and they're seeing this amazing edifice in the distance that they were just in. So now they're ruminating on what Jesus has said. As they sat on the Mount of Olives, they've had time to get over there, opposite the temple, Peter, James, and John, and Andrew come over and tap Jesus on the shoulder and ask him privately, you made a statement, they're thinking. Not one stone will be left upon another. Verse 4, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when these things are about to be accomplished? They're asking two questions. When and what? They're asking, when will these things be? And what will be the sign that they will be accomplished? If you want to read this text, this is important to understand. Jesus is answering these two questions, when and what. But he does it in sometimes a not so tidy way. Sometimes he's answering when, sometimes he's answering what, sometimes he goes back to what, then he goes back to when. And you have to really take the time to pull this text out and see what Jesus is doing. It's not overly complex, but you need to know that that's the framework in this chapter. He does the same thing in Matthew 24, and it sometimes gets a little confusing. I'll do my best not to confuse you. We're just going to cut to the chase and give you the gist of what is going on. But that's the framework in Jesus' answers. And what he does is sometimes he's talking about the moment that's coming in 70 AD. And sometimes he uses what's going to take place to the physical temple in 70 AD as a motif to express that what is happening to the temple is also going to happen to the whole wide world. And sometimes you don't always know, is he here or is he in the future? And sometimes it's a little challenging to read the text. And that's why we've had so many people read this same text that you're reading and come up with different ideas. Because it seems like this could fit there and this could fit there. I'll try to explain without confusing you any further because I'm already doing a good job, I can tell by your glassy eyes. Let's continue the text. Jesus began to say to them, is this talking about the present or the future? He's using now what's going to take place to the temple, and he's laying down that just as this temple is going to come down, there is not going to be one stone left upon another anywhere. Jesus began to say to them, see that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and they will lead many astray. This is a good tip, by the way. If you're confused why there's so many claims on when the world is going to end, and this is the last time, and there's a war going to happen, and it's going to be the last one, and what's going on in North Korea, and this is going to be it, and this is going to be it. Why is this always happening? Jesus said this. Be careful. Pay attention. Here's a tip. Do not get confused by all the white noise and a new book that comes out that December 21, 2019. This is nothing new. We are going to be doing this till the very end of the very end. It has always been this way from Jesus' day all the way to today. You can trace it. It is a fascinating history. And by the way, just a quick one, of the 20th century, just some numbers just to give you some ideas of how many times people have claimed the end of the world, all the way from 1910 when Halley's Comet was to bring poisonous gas into our atmosphere and wipe out the planet. I don't need to tell you that didn't happen. The Jehovah's Witnesses have had their run at prediction on the last final things. They have done that many, many times, right up to 1975. Do I need to tell you they've never been right yet? Wilbur Glenn Volvia, I don't know if you know that name. He's a little bit of he came from the 20s and 30s, a sort of a quasi-evangelical guy that believed in a flat earth. Fascinating character and had an enormous following and predicted the end of the world many years and had all kinds of, the church was in all kinds of upheaval, and it's never stopped. I don't know if you remember some of these numbers, some of these years, people predicting what was going to take place, Hal Lindsey, Pat Robertson. These are all on record, by the way. I got this list from the internet, so you know it's true. And I actually picked something. I very carefully looked through a bunch of things, because I didn't put this together myself. I'm not that dumb. But these were all footnoted, and I clicked on a number of the links, and I read some of the articles where this is actually what was in print. These are not made-up ideas. This has been constantly going on, that somebody has publicly claimed this is when it's going to happen, and this is the end of all things. I don't know if you remember the September 11 to 13, Edgar Whisenant, he was a NASA scientist, he was a believer, and he wrote a book, 88 Reasons That Jesus or Christ Will Return in 88. I don't know if you remember that book. That was the last time that I remember the evangelical church really getting in a knot and actually believing this. And it was quite a thing. I had people in my family that were phoning me and dealing with it and trying to understand what was going on. And surprisingly enough, nothing happened. So the next year he wrote a book, 89 Reasons, not a joke, why Jesus would return in 89. It wasn't quite as good a seller, but on and on it goes. And so you have constant and continual right up to Harold Camping, who doesn't seem to give up on all of this. Heaven's Gate, you remember that in 97? A UFO was going to come by and snatch people. It was going to be the beginning of the end, and on it goes right to 2000. This is only to 2000. If we kept going to 2019, we would just be bored here. This has not stopped, and this Jesus warned us about. There are going to be, as he said, wars and rumors of wars. Do not be alarmed. This is normal behavior. Everybody is in a panic, and they write their book, and they're going to tell you what's going to happen next Tuesday. Nobody's telling you what's happening in 1,000 years. They've all immediately panic, get your knickers in a knot, pardon the expression. Everybody should be upset. It's constant and continued, and Jesus warned us this is going to happen. Panic not. Nobody knows the day or the hour, but what we know is that things are winding down. When you hear wars, rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place. This is going to happen. It's going to be this constant churning. Why does God allow this constant churning within the hearts of people to bring them panic? I personally think it's to bring people to an awareness of a need of to get right with God. Why do people watch the news and feel like this? How much longer can this world go on? God is allowing and softening hearts to bring them, or hardening their hearts, either way, to bring them to himself. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is continuing. And if you look at the world, we now talk about climate change and all that's going on in the world, whether or not you believe in climate change. This is what they're blaming it on. I think, personally, it's part of this, their preparation in their own hearts. When things happen, leave God out of the equation. And I think God is allowing these things to take place again to soften people's hearts and make them think about end times, final things. There will be famines, but these are but the beginning of pains. Birth pains. Interesting expression, birth pains. Never had birth pains. I've actually witnessed them. Fascinating concept. Very pleased that had nothing to do with me. I have never seen somebody come so close to the point of death and yet live. But what are birth pains? They come on slow and gradual and gradual and greater and greater and greater in intensity. That's the idea, until finally, new life. This is the picture here. It's going to get worse and worse. And so, even in our age, we've seen all kinds of crazy weather events right up to this last week. What is going on? Why does God allow this continual bombardment and increasing? This is all part of what God said would happen. Christ said would happen. There's going to be this increasing awareness, this end of days feeling, whether it's a tornado, whether it's a volcano, whether it's a forest fire, whether it's a tsunami from an earthquake, on and on and on. And what is he doing? He is bringing hearts to a place, I think, in grace and in mercy, to say, you know what? This world's not going to last. And your soul is important. And you better consider the future. And you should think about where you're going. And you should consider important things. And as God ratchets up all that's going on, Jesus warned us. This is how it will go. But the end is not yet. It's going to get worse and worse and worse. And by my grace, I am going to continue to allow people to know that there is freedom in the cross, that they can come for forgiveness. And if you have not allowed these things to soften your heart and you've never come to Christ, you need to recognize your need, that he is being gracious to you and giving you life. Verse 9, be on your guard. They will deliver you over to councils. This is why we're wondering, is this talking about the disciples, or is this a future thing? Because this is what happened to them in the book of Acts. They were delivered over to councils and beaten in synagogues and standing before governors and kings to bear witness for them, before them. That's what happened. I mean, read the book of Acts. They're standing before counselors and kings and bearing. So is that for the disciples, or is this for everybody? Welcome to the realm of eschatology. We're not always sure, and it's not always tidy. And there's people that are called preterists. If you've heard this expression, I'm not sure why I'm bringing it up, except perhaps to warn you about it. It's a view that all of this was fulfilled at the destruction of Jerusalem. That all that took place that Jesus is talking about in Matthew 24, Luke 21, and Mark 13, all of it happened at the destruction of Jerusalem, and it's all fulfilled prophecy. I don't hold to that. I think this is talking about the future. I think there is coming a day when it is entirely possible, when it will become illegal to be a believer. That somehow something will take place. Be on your guard. Pay attention. There is a future coming where it's not always going to be pretty. And there's going to be some sifting from those who are real to those who say that they are real. And it's going to cost you your life. That's what it seems to say. Jesus is warning his people. Pay attention. We're heading down a road where things will get worse and worse and worse. Finally, parents will be giving up children, and children will be giving up parents. What's going to cause that? I don't know. What pressures are the governments going to put on people to say, if you don't report someone in your family, you lose your life? And so now people are pressured to give up their mother and their father and their uncle and their cousin, and and there's chaos. That's what we begin to see. This is going to get worse and worse. Happy days, people. Happy days. This is what Jesus has tried to tell us. If you go on a trip, you're going to go camping. You don't just jump in the car and drive off to the campsite and then say, oh, should have brought the trailer with us. If you're going to go camping and you know where you're going, you plan for the journey. You prepare accordingly. This is the end, so this is how I get ready. That's what Jesus has done to his disciples and to the church. This is what's happening, so just be ready. Just put on your boots and keep on your helmet and strap on the breastplate of righteousness and put on the belt of truth and put on the gospel shoes and stand firm in the faith and get ready. That's all he's done. He's told you where we're going. Verse 19. In those days, this is skipping ahead into the text. We're not looking at every verse in the text, or you'll be here for longer than you wish to be. In those days, there will be such tribulation as there has not been from the beginning of creation that God created until now and never will be. This is one of the reasons that we think he's talking about a future event. Because the great tribulation, or the tribulation, is, people say, if I'm not getting too detailed here, people say that the bringing down of the temple in Jerusalem would be the greatest tribulation that the Jewish people ever could have experienced. And that's the tribulation that Jesus is talking about here. The temple being destroyed has never happened from the beginning, and it is the worst thing that could possibly happen, and that's what Jesus is referencing. this concept of the such tribulation from the beginning to the end, it's over. It's not a future event. It's taken place in the past. That's a preterist view. It's very common even in churches to this day. I do not hold to that view. We believe, and I believe, Scripture points to a time, sometimes it's called Jacob's trouble, where there seems to be this period of time that some theologians and some pundits within the realm of eschatology have labeled this down to 7 years. That's where the number 7 comes from, which comes out of Daniel 9. We're confusing you now. I'm trying to keep this simple. Point being, there will be a time of tribulation, Jesus seems to hint. There's something coming. There's a period that's never been like any other period. Heads up. That's what he's saying. This is what the future looks like. Not only will it get worse and worse and worse, and Christianity becomes illegal, but now he says there will be a time of tribulation unlike any other time in history, greater than the Second World War, First World War. What is it going to look like? In those days, after the tribulation, wow, you skipped that, Jesus. I wanted to know what it would look like. We don't know. We just know it's going to be worse than any other time in human history. But after the tribulation, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, stars will be falling from heaven, the powers of the heavens, sun, moon, things like this will be shaken. Wow, this sounds cataclysmic. This sounds fascinating. This sounds like nothing we've ever seen on planet Earth ever before in the history of the world. Have you read the book of Revelation? There are some very interesting things that appear to be coming along the line in the future for planet Earth. And when a third of the earth is killed by a plague, and a third of the earth is poisoned because the waters have been poisoned, and on it goes. There's something coming down the road in the future, and Jesus used, again, the destruction of Jerusalem and the question of how he could just say not one stone will be left upon another to point to the fact that in essence, this is why we believe these things, because Jesus predicted something that would take place in 70 AD before it happened that seemed impossible that took place. So everything now that Jesus has also said, that we to our ears seems impossible, we believe him. And when they see the Son of Man coming in clouds in great power and glory, and then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heaven. This, of course, we call the second coming, and we are looking forward to this great and glorious day when Jesus will actually return. Why do we believe this? Acts 1, verses 10 and 11, gives us some understanding of why we're looking for Jesus to return in a physical way. While they were gazing into heaven, as he went, that's Jesus, behold, 2 men stood by them in white robes and said, Men of Galilee, he's talking to the disciples, Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking into heaven? This Jesus, who is taken up from you into heaven, will come in the same way you saw him go into heaven. This Jesus, not another Jesus, not somebody who looks like Jesus or is going to claim to be Jesus. No, this very same Jesus. And in the same way you saw him go, how did you see him go? Physically, visibly, we say bodily, literally. And so we now expect the exact, from this promise, the exact thing to be taking place in the future. In Revelation, we're told every eye will see him. There's going to be a physical, visible, bodily, literal return of Jesus, and the church has been looking for him ever since. Why do we believe this? Because Jesus predicted that the temple in Jerusalem would come down, and it did. And now we believe that everything else that he said about the future, he must know what's going on. He rose from the dead. We believe him. Scriptures tell us that he's coming back one day, and he's coming back for his own, and this great and glorious truth tells us something of what we need, how we need to be packing our bags and being ready, that all this bad stuff's going to happen, but you understand that something good is going to happen, that the king is going to come back for his own. And I'll just give you a word of warning: if you are not one of his own, you need to come into the kingdom. You need to understand what it is to bow the knee to this king, because he will come either as your king and savior or as your judge. And he will come to destroy those who are his enemies. Mark 13:33. This is what he warns his disciples. Let's wrap this up this morning. Be on guard. Keep awake. This is what he's saying now. I've told you all this is going to take place. So let's stay frosty, people. Let's remember where we're going. Let's not be distracted. Yes, we have lives and jobs and families and soccer practice and accounts and retirement and buildings and things that have to happen. We've got life, but pay attention. Don't get distracted is what he's saying. Be on your guard. Remember where we're going. Remember the end game and prepare accordingly. If that's where you're going, then that's how you pack. If that's where you're headed, then that's how you live. If that's what's going to happen, then get your life in order to fulfill what is going to take place. For you do not know when the time will come. We do not know if this will be in our lifetime or the next lifetime, the next generation. Every generation of the church has believed that they're the last generation from the time of Christ. I don't know if you know that, but we are no different to say, it can't get any worse than this. Maybe it can. Maybe your imagination is not big enough. Maybe you just haven't lived long enough. Maybe our children are going to say, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, our great-great-grandchildren are going to say, it can't get any worse than this. We do not know. So Jesus is warning people, plan, prepare, live accordingly. He gives this little illustration. It's like a man going on a journey. When he leaves home and puts his servants in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to stay awake. It's like a little vignette, a little picture. Here's a wealthy man who's going to go on a journey, and he says to the gardener, when I come back, I don't want to see any thorns or thistles in the garden. Here's your task. Keep the garden looking nice and cut the grass. Oh, okay, nobody's living here, but you've got a job to do. I'm coming back. I've given the baker opportunity to make sure that there's fresh bread every day coming out of the oven. Why would you do that? He's not even here. You don't know when he's coming back. Keep your task up. Keep working. Keep laboring. Keep going. Don't get distracted. Don't stop. Don't forget the end game. Don't lose sight of where we're headed. Don't misunderstand the future. Jesus is returning, and he's going to lay claim for everything we have done. He's left us with a task. He's told us to build his kingdom in simple terms. And if we get lazy, we get lackadaisical, we think that church is our own a private club, that we're just having fun, we are losing sight of the big picture. Jesus has warned his disciples, not one stone will be left upon another. How is that possible? Let me explain. Things are going to get worse, and one day I'm going to come back. So be ready. That's what he's saying. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or when the cock crows, or in the morning, lest he come suddenly and find you asleep. What I say to you, I say to all. This is one of the reasons why I believe this has also got a future context. I'm not just talking to you four. Those are the four that's talking to him. I'm saying this to every generation that's to come. Stay awake. Pay attention. We have a king who is going to return, and he's going to ask us to give an account for the task he has given us as God's people in building his kingdom. Stay awake. Pay attention. You know the end game. You know where it's going. Get your life in order. Get your heart in order if you don't know Christ. Be ready. This is the Gospel of Mark.